Yeah. Okay. And that takes us to segment number 3. In the montage, you heard Big Mouth Strikes Again, and now you're going to hear Some Girls Are Bigger Than Others.
I have just discovered some girls are bigger than others. Some girls are bigger than others. Some girls' mothers are bigger than other girls' mothers. Some girls are bigger than others. Some girls are bigger than others. Some girls' mothers are bigger than other girls' mothers.
Okay. Matt, why don't you run the numbers for The Queen is Dead from the Smiths?
Well, there you go. The Grand Poobah, the number one of the 80s. Here you go. Best ever albums. Number 1 in the 80s, 1 in 86, 17 of all time. It is the Smiths' highest rated album on Best Ever Albums. And they are ranked number 12 of overall artist rankings. And they did make Rolling Stone's list. I think they're at 1. I didn't write it down. It's in the 140s. 113, sorry. 113 on Rolling Stone. So there you go.
17th best album of all time.
Of all time, Josh.
Okay.
Or 113 if you're Rolling Stone. But yeah, between the two. Maybe split the difference, I guess.
Got it.
All right. Well, I mean, boy, this could be quite the bio because there's a lot of interesting stuff
I'm sure.
about the Smiths. I'll try to condense it to the basics, which is sort of the classic story of when Johnny Marr, the lead guitarist, met Stephen Morrissey, the lead singer, right? Which is kind of, I think, completely unfairly how people think of the Smiths sometimes, that it's like Morrissey and Marr and then there's these two other dudes, and
Yeah.
we'll talk about that later. But like these two other dudes, certainly, and no, famously, that is sort of like what both Morrissey and to a lesser extent Marr tried to say when they sued for royalties later, and famously lost that lawsuit. But in case you're wondering, the other members of the band are Mike Joyce, the drummer, and Andy Rourke, the bassist. I've said before, if you write the bass line for Barbarism, you don't get to be called a bit player because that's just too good. And we cover that in Meat is Murder. But anyway, the story is very interesting because the first time Johnny Marr, whose real name is John Mayer, Maher, so not like the guitarist John Mayer, but like a different version of it, but
Bill
pronounced
Maher.
the same. Like Bill Maher, exactly. So it's John. He basically stylized it Marr, right, as opposed to Maher. When I see that, I want to say Mayer, but it's more Marr in the pronunciation. Yes, so that's what you're looking at. And Morrissey, they first met when Marr was 14 and Morrissey was 19, and they were at a concert, and it was a Patti Smith gig actually, which makes a lot of sense in a number of things. Morrissey would actually cover Redondo Beach later in his solo career, but they met each other. It was at the Apollo Theater in Manchester, and they sort of talked about poetry, literature, connected on stuff like that. At the time, Morrissey had through his teenage years, he'd pretty famously, and you can look it up, he'd written a bunch of letters to Melody Maker, which was a music magazine, just commenting about bands he liked and groups he liked. And he was the UK president of the New York Dolls fan club. And he even had sort of done like fan literature / almost like a fan type bio. So he kind of was like a super fan, right? And that is a big thing with Morrissey. He likes classic Hollywood and touches on that quite a bit. Whereas Marr was a little bit more of a traditionalist, right? Standard rock and roll stuff like that. So anyway, they connected, thought they really did well, but time goes on, right? So 78, Marr's going through basically his high school years. Morrissey's going through what would, I guess in America we'd call his college years. And then interestingly enough, as the story goes, there's variations of this story, right? Like, so take what you will in terms of how much is exact there. Marr is playing. He wins a competition that our good friends at Stiff Records held, in which Nick Lowe, who we covered of Cruel to
Be Kind
fame, yes, had made a contest. Stiff Records says for Produce Your Band, where he was going to produce a band, but Marr never actually ends up consummating like that production relationship, I guess. And all of this leads to basically him showing up on like Morrissey's door and saying like, would you like to form a band? Pretty much is kind of how it goes. And he was inspired by a songwriting partnership, Jerry Lieber and Mike Stoller from like the 50s, and he was aware of that, and pretty much he decides to go for it. He shows up with his friend and just says, let's form a band, and Morrissey says yes. So they rehearse. There's multiple earlier members of the band. They're trying to figure out how their sound's going to go together, because Marr is more of a traditional, rock player, and obviously his sound is already being developed at that point, which was a mishmash of jangle rock and, Keith Richards type riffs. And then, you've got Morrissey, who's looking back to crooners and, glam rock and stuff like that. They do pretty quickly coalesce around the name The Smiths, which was basically the idea of like picking the most ordinary name possible, right? Like the Smiths, right? Like there's no more generic last name than that, and that's kind of what it is. It's sort of like we're the everyman band. They also, Morrissey decides that he's not going to go by anything besides just one name, right? And then Marr is the one who gave him the nickname Maz, which is like a nickname his solo career would have later. The gentleman who shows up at Morrissey's door with Johnny Marr, a gentleman by the name of Steve Pomfret, has a falling out with the other members of the band, which would be a theme of like the members of this band. He's replaced by a bass player named Dale Hibbert, who lasts for a while. There's a drummer by the name of Simon Wollstonecroft. These are all guys that Marr sort of knew, but Wollstonecroft sort of decides, not so much in terms of joining the band, and they do auditions, and that is where they find Mike Joyce. Mike Joyce pretty famously said that he was under the influence of mushrooms during his audition. So, yep. So
there's a way to go.
Yeah. So like that.
I was too for this current job I have. That's what I'm
saying. It does increase the. Psychedelics are in vogue right now. So,
they are.
So maybe there's something to that. But there's all kinds of like funny stories about how they're trying to like get their sound together. Like Morrissey's real big on like what the aesthetic of the band is going to be. That's a big piece of how he's doing it. Johnny Marr sort of was trying to cultivate like a rock star thing. It's important to remember how young Johnny Marr is when he's in this band as well. Finally, after just going through different bassists, they're really having a falling out with Hibbert, the bassist they brought in. They didn't like the sound, especially Morrissey and Marr didn't think he was particularly good, and Hibbert is described as not particularly gelling with what he called the band's gay aesthetic. So he gets replaced by a guy that Johnny Marr went to school with, Andy Rourke. I'm always amazed that like people that are as good at like instruments, like both are in the same school together. So it's like, oh, in the same graduating class, there's like Johnny Marr and like Andy Rourke, both these guitar are in like the same school, right? And Hibbert, by the way, denies that he said anything about like not liking the gay aesthetic. He says that it was more just he found them to be very difficult to get along with as people, which, in fairness, there's just as good a chance that that's possibly the case. Anyway, they then get to a demo in December of 1982. Some of the songs that would go on the debut album are there, and then other things that are, pretty famous B-sides, like These Things Take Time and What Difference Does It Make and stuff like that. Those are being created as well, which would start a pretty much career trend of like some of the stuff ending up on albums and some of the stuff not ending up on albums. We covered quite a bit like the lead up to their early album, so I won't go too much into that. Fame came pretty quickly to them. They had a lot of fans pretty quickly. John Peel's BBC radio show takes them immediately. The British press takes to them immediately. They were, if you watch them in this era, they were a very good live band, and they really had a sense of the moment. There was just something about, I think the combination of Morrissey's presence and their rhythm section and Johnny Marr's style of guitar that was like the perfect fit with the moment. So they blow up. They're dogged always by controversy. I mean, there's a bunch of different stuff. There's the song from the first album, Suffer Little Children, which some people said was exploitative, but pretty famously Morrissey, I keep saying pretty famously this week, I would say Morrissey went and met with the parents who were sort of saying it was exploitative and kind of won them over and described what the song was about and how it was not at all exploitative. It was designed to be sort of like a discussion of it and, frame it in like kind of a grotesque way. People claim they had, pedophilia. Obviously, Morrissey was giving them absolutely nothing about his sexuality, feeling from like I'm celibate to I'm not going to use pronoun. He basically was very much, in both in terms of knowing how to be provocative, but also not really wanting to share in the way that you would think from a band that calls themselves the Smiths, right? Like, he was sort of playing that whole street. As early as this time, Morrissey was flirting with, shall we call, like nationalistic elements of England, which continues to escalate as time goes on to the fact that there are some people that have canceled him in their,
He's pro-Brexit.
Pop culture. He's pro-Brexit. He's definitely a Britons for British people type. I mean, he definitely leans even more into that in his solo career. I think of the song like Bengali and Platforms and stuff. There's some stuff there. But anyway, he also is, as you would see by the second album, Meat is Murder, he is very stridently, some might say even violently, vegetarian and pro-animal rights.
A violent vegetarian. That's awesome.
Violent in the sense of he does not refrain from saying that people who eat meat are bad people, that bad things should happen to, and evoking sort of some of the more militant things. And as you might, so meat is, the Smiths sort of is, if you think of it this way, the Smiths is sort of designed to introduce the band as branding and just that generic part, and they're just there, right? Meat is Murder is sort of a way for him to talk about probably the biggest cause of his life. And The Queen is Dead covers another theme, which is direct antagonism towards the monarchy. And this album, as you may notice, definitely has a theme. It's definitely kind of like the Kinks and stuff, where it's talking about English life, but it's definitely talking about a different type of English life. It sort of is like a combination of like what the Kinks were talking about mixed with sort of the chaos that those bands in the late 70s were talking about, like the two-tone bands at the Clash and stuff. I think that is sort of the general vibe. He was not a fan of Margaret Thatcher, nor was the rest of the band, so it wasn't just him. They were, kind of continued that theme. So, I mean, there is so much leading up to this album. It's released in June 1986. The lead single is Big Mouth Strikes Again. There are two massive songs in Britain. There Is a Light That Never Goes Out and The Boy with the Thorn in His Side. They're a huge band in Britain. Their lane in America in the 80s is really interesting in that they are a big indie band, but they don't cross over to the mainstream really at all. The Smiths in many ways don't really start their crossover to the mainstream until the 90s and the 2000s, when they start to get viewed as like a big band in America, right? Like in their time, they were more of sort of a like a cult band, I guess, maybe a little bit bigger than that. During this time, Andy Rourke's also doing a metric shit ton of heroin. There's like,
not good.
There's just a lot. So we'll start with that because there's something else big right here. It's the story, as I read in many different places, is that he's using it quite a bit by his own admission, to the point where he could understand why the band was thinking about parting ways with him. He's drinking a lot too, and he eventually gets fired in early 1986 as, this album is in the process of being finished and released. The story is that he received the notice of being fired via a Post-it note that was placed on the windshield of his car that said, quote, "Andy, you have left the Smiths. Goodbye and good luck, Morrissey." Morrissey claims this never happened. Andy Rourke is very clear it's happened. Both of them say that in sworn testimony, so someone is perjuring themselves. You know what I mean? And that who it is, I don't know. I know the judge very much weighed in on the side of believing that it was Andy Rourke who was telling the truth. So they bring in a guy by the name of Craig Gannon, who was in a band that actually we don't cover, but you probably have heard the name of, called Aztec Camera. They're kind of like a critically acclaimed band. But then they decided just 2 weeks later to just reinstate Andy Rourke, because it sounds not there.
Because he kicked his heroin habit. He was done. 2 weeks.
I can't make it up. They asked Gannon to stay in the band, and he switches to rhythm guitar. And they record 2 songs, Panic and Ask, both of which are not on this album. But they're pretty famous songs. They're B-sides, both great songs. And both of them chart. So they're charting on the UK singles while this album is out with songs that aren't on this album. So it's kind of, yeah. And so Rourke still is sort of like, he's back, but he's getting busted for drug possession, so he can't tour on the North American tour. It's like Johnny Marr's also drinking a ton at this time. I should also mention that they are in a legal dispute with Rough Trade Records that delays this album by 7 months. It inspires the song Frankly Mr. Shankly on this album quite a bit, which if you read the lyrics, you can quickly do it. And also inspires the song Paint a Vulgar Picture on Strange Ways Here We Come, which is the next album that they released. So it's kind of right there. So they tour the U.S. during this time. It goes somewhat well. They're looking to see if they want a different American label. So there's just a lot of tumult on this. I think the crazy thing about the Smiths is like they kind of were formed in 82. They do an album in 83, 85, 86, and 87, and then they're broken up at the end of 87. And it's kind of like that's the arc, right? It was this quick... the last one's called Strange Ways Here We Come, and it basically is designed to sort of foreshadow that the band is falling apart. I'll do a quick postscript here because there's not much. The band was sort of terminated by Johnny Marr. He's just like, I need to kind of get away and do side projects. In his mind, he didn't formally finish the band, but like Morrissey feels very betrayed by this and thinks about continuing with the band with Joyce and Rourke, but like then eventually decides no, it's not going to happen, and they break up the band. And famously, all of the members have Rourke and Joyce don't really have issues with each other. They go through a period where they're still friendly with Marr, but he's sort of very much on Morrissey's side, where it's like, we should get most of, if not all of the royalties, and you guys should get like a very small percentage. And the other guys are like, no, like that's not cool. Eventually it goes into court, in which they basically, Joyce and Rourke separately sue the other two for 25% splits across the board. The judges rule in favor of Rourke and Joyce, which pisses off both Morrissey and Marr, but to different levels. It pisses Morrissey off to like taking up 100 pages of his autobiography levels of anger, you know what I mean? And in Marr's case, more like, we'll agree to disagree, right? But, he kind of at the end, I think, saw a little bit more of maybe we weren't necessarily fair for the contributions, and he definitely is not, he very much recognizes the contribution of Joyce and Rourke, whereas Morrissey sort of refers to them as glorified side players, and he and Marr were sort of the engine because they...
How old was Marr at this time when this album came out? Probably like 20.
So when the first one comes out, he's 19. Okay. So it's 3 years later, so he's 22 at this point. Okay. Yeah. And Rourke's around that same age. So, I mean, these are young guys, right? Yeah. And there's a lot of chemical substances with all but Morrissey. The other guys are all partaking heavily. And it's often Morrissey and Marr often sort of positioned as like a romance to some degree. They had like an intense creative partnership by both of their means, not sexual or anything, but more like that type of energy, right? Like, and so like when there was the equivalent of falling out, breakup, it kind of was almost like an end of a marriage, right? But Mar and Mar, Joyce, and Rourke at different times have worked together. Like they've played on side pieces, but Morrissey, for a couple of his solo albums, I believe he worked with both Joyce and Rourke before the royalties suit, but he has famously not worked with any of them since. And the band, all of them, have said that they do not want to reunite. They have turned down astronomical amounts of money to reunite. And yeah, I mean, we are now at the point when they are basically all in their 60s, and they have not done it, and so they seem to be committed.
Firm band that's not.
Didn't
not
Morrissey
coming
say
back.
he'd rather dip his balls in hot boiling oil or something
There's
like
a
that?
lot of over the top comments. I remember they definitely VH1 had a show where they tried to reunite bands, and they were having like a steady run of success, and they tried with the Smiths, and I think like Joyce and Rourke are like, well, we might entertain it, but you really need to talk to like Johnny Marr and Morrissey, and like they famously could not get a hold of them, and just they were basically like, fuck no, and like almost like indignant that like VH1 was like imposing on them this, it almost seemed like it existed outside of any sort of like the rest of them always seemed like they were working with the band's management to manufacture it. It definitely did not feel that like that with the Smiths. So yeah, so that was sort of famously it was.
Were
a
they still
complete
popular
non-success.
with critics with the Queen is Dead being such a provocative type of?
They stayed popular with the critics their entire career. Every one of their albums was critically lauded across the board, the four big ones, as were the compilations Hatful of Hollow and Louder Than Bombs, which kind of sometimes can feel like Louder Than Bombs can feel like an album because like half the tracks were never on albums. So it's like an album in its own right. But yep, I don't normally do long bios, but there's a lot. There's so many anecdotal stories that are ridiculous, hilarious along the way because you're dealing with very big personalities. I'll kind of leave it there for right now.
And you've read his bio too, right, Morrissey?
Oh yeah, his bio's hilariously long. He argued for the Penguin Classics designation to release it, which is like so you'll find it in the same rack as with Pride and Prejudice and like Jane Eyre and Moby Dick and Morrissey's biography.
I forgot about that.
Yes,
That's amazing.
There's you never quite know, you know what I mean? Like he's definitely earnest and means a lot of stuff and serious as a heart attack on some things, and then there's that sort of like English scamp a little bit, and then there's like a line where you're like, I don't know. But either his earnestness or his scamp is hilarious either way, so we'll kind of go that way.
I mean, he seems to famously like back out of dates and cancel.
Oh, he cancels shows all the time. If you watch him nowadays, if you watch his soul, like to give you an idea, I've been scheduled to see Morrissey on 2 different occasions, and both times the show was canceled and never rescheduled. So like, I still own all of that money. But yes, now when you see him perform, he is doing hilarious things like a week residency in Las Vegas where people just rush the stage and hug him, and he just sort of like holds court. He had famously, and we'll probably talk about him in the 90s because I never covered that. Like he became like an icon in like Mexican culture, which is a whole hilarious like sub thing in its own right, where like I don't even know where to begin on that, but that's a whole thing. Johnny Marr sat in as a set player for a variety of bands across the board. We can go into different stuff. I know that at the time we all met each other, he was sitting with Modest Mouse, I believe, at the time, but he's been with a variety of different ones. So
does a lot of film work now, too.
Andy Rourke moved to New York, and I went to one of his shows as a DJ one time without realizing that I was. So there's another funny story. Anyway, I'll stop there. Josh, you get first take. The Queen is Dead.
Well, this is kind of a deceptive album in some ways because I think it's easy to listen to it a couple times and say it sounds like the other Smiths albums, but I feel like everyone is kind of in top form on this album. Johnny Marr's guitar, I think he's on fire on this, and Rourke, and the other guy whose name I'm now blanking
Mike
on.
Joyce.
Mike Joyce. They're also noticeably present and good on this album as well. And then so you have this, one layer of the music being really great, and they are keeping up with kind of their troubadour crooning sound with a lot of like upbeat, jaunty ditties, and then you have another layer of like Morrissey's lyrics. Like, in my opinion, the Patti Smith comparison or story is apt, because I feel like that's the level of lyric writing that we're dealing with on this album, and I feel like that kind of raised the album to another level for me. Is it the number one album? No, but I think it's probably the best Smiths album that I've heard, and it's definitely a strong it's probably my top 25 or something. But the lyrics themselves are, anytime the lyrics I think rise above me noticing them on a certain level and then like actually listening to them again while reading them, I think that kind of is a sign for me that something special is going on. I think Cemetery Gates is probably one of the best lyrical songs that we've listened to, in my opinion. It's both biting and hilarious, what he's saying in that song about not plagiarizing poems, and kind of making fun of somebody who claims to be writing these songs or these using these lines as their own when they're not. And I think that carries through, like you said, the scampish nature of the lyrics are prevalent throughout the entire album. Frankly, Mr. Shankly is such like an upbeat takedown of them, and then ending with the lyric of "Give us your money" is really funny. And then Vicar in a tutu, that's kind of apparent in the title itself, just kind of making fun of religion in that way, and then kind of on and on with Some Girls Are Bigger Than Others is just kind of like the lyrics are funny in that as well, and the content of that. But I think not just lyrics, but musically, I feel like.
Did you catch how he turns it from like a romantic thing to talking about like Cleopatra and Mother? Like it's a little turn of hand, slight, but it cracks me up every time.
Yeah, so. and there is a cleverness here that I really appreciate in his writing. But then I think Johnny Marr's guitar, which I've said before on previous Smiths albums, I really respond to. I feel like he's taking it to another level here as well. There's also, incorporation of other instruments that I really like the flute that comes in at "There Is a Light That Never Goes Out," which is definitely one of their most famous songs, I would say, and the most recognizable one for me, for sure. But then also in Some Girls Are Better Than Others, the music, it fades in and out at the beginning intentionally, clearly. I thought that was an interesting effect that they were doing. And then even something like on "The Queen Is Dead," the first track, where the drum beat is very noticeable and prominent in my listening to it, and that was just another indication that the rhythm section was also on point. So yeah, I really like this album. I totally get kind of, after listening to three albums and some B-sides, I totally get kind of their cult appeal, and why also they would never kind of translate bigger in the US. They are kind of English in that way, right? Just with some of those other bands that we've listened to.
It depends on whether "doesn't translate" means tons of bands rip off elements of their style and sell shit tons of records.
Oh, sure.
I would argue they very much translate in that case.
Yeah,
so, yeah.
But I guess when they were around in such a short time too, it's hard to. Sometimes there's a delay in terms of popularity, like you pointed out. But yeah, I don't really have anything bad to say about this album. I enjoyed it quite a bit. Now, what did you think?
Yeah, so this is the album, like not knowing the Smiths albums, because it's just their stuff's just singles peppered everywhere that I've been exposed to. So this is the one that comes through. I'm like, okay, like now you're giving me like a lot of what I either know or want, or the consistency is definitely here that I thought was kind of missing definitely with the first album, and to a lesser extent with the second record with Mina's Murder. But it's, you could tell like this is where they are. I agree that this is where they're fully formed. It's, and I like Morrissey's not doing remember that falsetto that he was kind of going crazy with a little bit in previous records. There's like none of that at all. It's just
he's
retired
that.
Entirely. Thankfully. Like a note here, there's fine, but what he was doing in that first record in particular was just not, in my opinion, not necessary. So, but geez, I think you're right, Josh. I think this is everybody kind of just gelling together, bringing what they do best at the same time. And even for the non-lyrics guy, I have to pay attention to Morrissey's lyrics more so than I do other artists. It's just the way. Like, there's so many laugh out loud things on here when he talks about like, getting hit by, he has a love song about let's get hit by a double decker bus. Like that's the best way to go. It's just, then the way he sings it, the way it's kind of like, it's like he's kind of tongue in cheek, but he's also kind of serious at the same time, oddly enough. And then he talks, Big Mouth Strikes Again. I was just kidding when I said I'd like to, mash every tooth in your head, or, it's like, who says stuff like that, so that they have to, this is the definition of lyrics that just have to stand out from time to time, even to someone like me. So I still think, to me, the Smiths is I'm there more for the music, and I'm seeing here that looks like Johnny Marr wrote all the music and Morrissey did all the lyrics, and that's probably what was that just consistent across the board, John, pretty much?
That was the basis of the lawsuit, right? Like, kind of like.
But I mean, did Joyce do anything? Did Rourke do any? Like, was there any like writing credits that they ever got, or?
Well,
is it just
they wrote
much...
the bass lines and they created the drumscape, right? But like, they didn't write.
So I'm always that just like a side note kind of a thing. Like, if Andy Rourke wrote the bass line for "There Is a Light That Never Goes Out," which he probably did. Mm-hmm. He has to get a writing credit for that. How does he not get a writing credit for that song? Like, that is such an integral part. And the great thing about that bass line, it's not even one bass line, it's at least two. Because
they would argue that if you write the guitar part, you're writing the bass line around the guitar part, right?
I guess, but man, oh man.
Around the guitar. I know. I'm with you, but like that's the argument.
But you're just, when you have a guy that can do that, just adding, and I'll probably speak more highly of him than Mike Joyce, because I'm going to pick up more on the music than the drums necessarily. Like I don't just I have a little bit more of an ear for that, or my ear goes in that direction. But I was definitely paying attention to Rourke's bass throughout this, because there's just so many great elements that it's just thrown in there, and it's so melodic. It's got that McCartney-esque quality to it. It does really interesting things, and it becomes like, in some of these songs, it becomes like a really important foundation, but it's not an overbearing thing. It doesn't take over the song. It just adds such a layer to it. And Johnny Marr's doing so much. I agree with you, Josh. Like, his guitar, like, it's just that jangle guitar, the different tones that he uses. He does mix up the tones a little bit. And it's so appealing. And it's so, gosh, Cemetery Gates, sorry. The beginning of that, I was just like, man, that sounds just like that Sunday song. Like, you could, those 90s, was it the Little Things? I forgot the name of the Sun, but the Sundays have a song. This beginning of that is exactly the same, so you can, it's like that 90s kind of, jangle alternative rock sound, and Johnny Marr's all over that. You could definitely see how influential they were on so many artists that came later on. But I don't know, man. I just think that I think that with the bass really stands out to me, and the more I listen to them, the more I really appreciate that. But it's a really fully formed record. It's awesome. I love, like, even the small the songs I didn't know as well, like I Know It's Over and Never Had No One Ever. Really like both of those songs. I like how I Know It's Over is like this. It's probably it looks like it's the second longest track on their album, but it kind of starts off as like this ballad, but then it builds up a little bit. Morrissey's he's raising his voice a little bit, but not going quite into the falsetto, and it builds really nicely, and it's a really kind of nice juxtaposition as to what's happening in some of the other songs. And Never Had No One Ever is just like this kind of eerie, kind of like, it's, I don't want to say it's repetitive, but it's the same kind of thing that's happening throughout it, and it's just a really cool vibe that's happening there. I just love this, that like orally, like this sounds great. It's just a really great sounding record. Like the production, the decisions that they make in terms of what to do with the guitar tone, how to make the bass flow in and out of it. And Morrissey's got such a distinctive voice. Is this the best album of the 80s? I don't know if I would say that, but it's up there. It's really good. It's certainly at least a couple of steps up from their last two records, and I see why, it is so lauded. So yeah, it's a big thumbs up for me. There's a lot of stuff I like about this record.
Well, I mean, there's 2 more years, but this is my number one of the 80s. I mean, like, the Smiths are the Velvet Underground of the 80s, in that, like, you listen to them and then the next 30 years makes sense, because the amount of bands that created their career off of this sound or bits of this sound. I mean, how many can we talk about? I mean, my God, there's so many bands that came, all of Brit rock, that came in the 90s, right?
It's a 90s sounding record. Like that's
right.
Yeah.
Well, that's because they created the template. For
exactly.
The 90s
right.
in
Yeah.
many ways. Like nothing in the 80s, by the way, sounds like this, and everything to some degree in the 90s and 00s sounds like this, which is like, when listening in context is so important, because the Smiths kind of sound like REM. They kind of sound like The Cure. They kind of sound like, even a little bit like, the Jam or U2 or at different points, but like no one, like the parts that make them, the intense jangle of Johnny Marr, like Morrissey's unique combo of sound mixed with lyrics, the rhythm section, right, which is this tight, groovable, dancey, thing that almost like owes more to the world of like funk at times than it does to rock. I mean, they're their own thing, and then all kinds of people, whether they're like directly stealing, like the Killers and the Shins and Oasis and people, or whether they're lightly or Coldplay's another, or whether they're I mean, Radiohead owes a lot to this band. You know what I mean? And they're all fans of this band.
Yeah.
I also think like this album is so good lyrically. Like, we've listened to a lot of good things, but like this album is like, if you can forgive a lot about what Morrissey is when you write songs that are this fucking good all the time. Like, I mean, like every song has parts that are hilarious mixed with parts that are profound, sometimes in the same like
phrase,
general area. It's like, I mean, Queen is Dead alone. I mean, like when you go from like, I broke into the palace with a sponge and a rusty spanner. She said, I know, and you cannot sing. I said, that's nothing. You should hear me play the piano.
Yeah,
which
that's
is
a good
objectively fucking hilarious. And then it's like when you say, we go for a walk when it's dry, talk about precious things, but when you're tied to your mother's apron, no one talks about castration. I mean, that's and it sounds really wordy when I say it, but he makes it work. While this, like in a pop song, it's like, it's remarkable like that. And like, frankly, Mr. Shankly goes from like lowbrow humor to like stuff that's, like stuff like I've got the 21st century breathing down my neck, which is like so, cutting, with what the record label was trying to tell them to do. I mean, everybody kind of knows that There's a Light That Goes Out is like a traditional, like, it's like the romanticism that's grotesque in that, like, you love someone so much that the greatest manifestation of it is like death, which goes back to like Byron, right, and the Romantics, and then he ties it in, right, like Keats and Yeats are on your side, like, so there's an underpinning of those romantics, right, Vicar in a Tutu has like a hilarious choice of almost like a rockabilly-esque like guitar in it, like that was absolutely chosen on purpose, I'm sure. Like, I know some people get pissed off that like they think that like some girls are bigger than others, like Johnny Marr's like epic guitar line is wasted on like a trivial song, but even that song's kind of funny if you see what he's basically doing, which is like, going from talking about people's mothers to like romantic love with the over the top thing of Mark Antony and Cleopatra, like basically saying like people marry their mother kind of, and which comes up a couple different times. Big Mouth Strikes Again is another song that like lyrically is just incredible. What, you know, the Joan of Arc with the Walkman, and he keeps changing it to modern technology with Joan of Arc, and just there's just so many flourishes that are just like fantastic. And I mean, if you're gonna lean into like the genius that's Morrissey at times, like this is like where you start, because this isn't just good lyrically, that's like incredible lyrically.
Yeah.
And yeah, as you guys mentioned, like the rhythm section, which has already been showing flourishes, like just, you know, I know you didn't mention the drumming, but the drumming on this album, when you have like Johnny Marr's guitar, you have Morrissey's presence, and you have like some of the stuff that Andy Rourke does on bass lines, these super groovy bass lines, like it is a hard gig to play the drums, right? Because you have to figure out like what's your space in that. And on this album, they just explore that, right? Sometimes it's right out in front, like on track 1. Sometimes it's in the background, just running support. Sometimes it's running parallel with the bass lines, right? It's all over the place. He does a really good job of blending in to the different songs. Yeah, I mean, this is a quintessential album for the 80s, both as a standalone piece of art, as sort of a amalgamum of like where music is going, and just like it's a redo of the Velvet Underground albums, or you know, in the 70s something like Big Star or Television, right, where you're listening to it, or like what Iggy Pop, right? There's just certain things where you're like, yeah, I mean, this is gonna define the next, you know, 20 years, because I hear this over and over and over again, but I didn't hear this before this. And like, oh yeah, there it is. Like, this is where this came from definitively. And so, yeah, I mean, strongest recommendation, this one. The first 2 albums, as we mentioned, were, you know, they had their moments, like real good moments, but then they had a lot of filler. Like I said before, there's an argument to be made that they should have padded some of those albums with the B-sides. The crazy thing here is that they're churning this out, and they're churning out top tier singles on top of it. So you've got like some Beatles shit here, right? Where you're like a great album and doing like top tier B-sides that aren't even on this. And this is that period here and leading up to Strange Ways where they are just like deeply prolific. So, yep, that would be my take.
And it would be hard to see how this could be topped in their last couple of albums, but
I mean, there's only one more.
Yeah,
Strange Ways, and they go in a couple different directions on that one too. So it's an interesting album that we'll have plenty to say about, I'm sure, there too.
It's interesting too. Like, I'm just thinking about more, because I know some of the Morrissey's solo songs. You know, I guess does he start writing music at that point in time? Because it does sound like Smiths type stuff. It does, you know, sound like.
Well, he would work with Mick Ronson, like, you know, Mick Ronson, the producer. He works with him for a little bit. He brings like guys from like the glam rock era in at different times.
So he doesn't ever really write music.
He always has remarkable collaborators early in his career, and then he came back with those albums in like 2004 and 2006, and you know, the thing that stood out about those albums to me was like his backing band in like 04 and 06 was tremendous. Like he really knows how to pick background, you know, musicians. They're like top tier session player types. So that's kind of what he did, right? He like, it's kind of like that old thing of like you bring in the Wrecking Crew, right? And like, you know, yeah, you're writing your stuff, but you're like, all right, give me like solid dead pros who can record this and or play this live.
Yeah.
So yeah. Yep.
Great. Yeah, thumbs up from all 3 of us. Definitely high.
Sure. Really good week albums this week. I think maybe if I aggregate score any week on CTS, this might be my highest aggregate score of a set of 3 albums.
Oh, wow.
I deeply liked each of these albums. Like each of these are in like the 50 to 60 range total score of my chart. So I don't know if we've ever had a week where all 3 albums were 50 or above.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe some of the later 60s episodes when we were, you know, covering the ones that were in the top 10 of that could be. Right?
Yeah, because we didn't go by years. We went by the rankings. So
certainly since we've been doing years, I don't think there was an episode of the 70s and the 80s, like 3 album thing that was 3 albums that were this profusely thumbs up for me. But for me, my aesthetics. So
Yeah.